I'm so sorry, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Inquirer Live at Gameday Central. Alongside EJ Smith, I am Olivia Reiner. We are coming at you from Lincoln Financial Field, getting set for the Eagles' preseason finale against the Minnesota Vikings. The Eagles have the opportunity today to sweep the preseason for the first time since 2016. We'll see if they are able to do it. EJ, how you doing today?
I would say the word that comes to mind is relieved. Olivia, I almost wore the same exact jacket. I looked at it in my closet. I was like, it might be time to break out the pink jacket. Decided not to, which would have been, I guess it would have been good for the show. We've had matching jackets on the show before. Maybe not me and you, but we have had them in the past. So maybe next week we'll break out the matching pink jackets. Jokes aside, doing well. It's nice to have a home preseason game, especially this third one. It's just nice to be in a familiar environments after the last couple of weeks. So yeah, excited for the show, excited for the game, and excited honestly for the regular season. It's right around the corner now. So yeah, all in all, we're doing well.
I'm excited to see that pink blazer of yours. You're going to really pack that into your suitcase for Brazil. I will hold you to it.
You never know.
See.
Yeah.
Before we get into our conversation today, EJ, just a reminder to everyone watching that you can be a part of our conversation too. If you're watching on YouTube, on Facebook, feel free to drop us a comment in the chat. We'll answer some of your questions if you've got them. Also, during the game today, make sure you're over on inquirer.com/Eagles Game Day. I will be jumping in that chat and engaging with all of you, answering your questions during the game in real time. So make sure you head on over there as well. All right, EJ, we've got a whole lot to discuss today. A lot of, obviously the Eagles, the final trade, the final cut down is looming. The Eagles have to trim their roster to 53 players on Tuesday. However, before we can talk about that, we have to talk about the newest addition to the Eagles roster in Jahan Dodson. They acquired him from the Washington Commanders the other day. They gave up not only a third round pick, but also 2 7 picks in 2025, acquiring both Dodson and the 5th round pick in 2025. The Eagles had kind of said over and over again throughout the preseason, the training camp period, that the third receiver spot was going to be filled by committee. And now with Dodson, we have a clear front runner for that third receiver role. He was a 16th overall pick in 2022 out of Penn State. He is a native of the Lehigh Valley. I remember watching him coming out of Penn State and thinking, wow, this guy, he's extremely explosive. He's got real downfield threat, big play potential. When you envision what this Eagles offense could look like with Kellen Moore as the new coordinator, and then AJ Brown, Devontae Smith being the primary targets in the passing game, how do you think that Dodson could potentially complement the entire operation?
Yeah, no, I think he's going to slot right in as that number 3 wide receiver, like you said. It's interesting because he's played that role in Washington before. He was behind Terry McLaurin and Curtis Samuel last season, each of the last 2 seasons. And, I think that's important because, sometimes you'll get a guy who is, become had a featured role in his previous stop, and they have to adjust to being the third option. And, in the Eagles offense, you're really the 4th option. This year, you're really kind of the 5th option with Saquon Barkley also. So, and, Jalen Hurts is going to call his own numbers. So there's always limited targets in this offense. So I think having a guy like Jahan Dotson who's operated in that, type of role before is important. I also think it's really important that he has inside out versatility. We've seen AJ Brown and Devontae Smith both playing in the slot at times during training camp. I think especially with Devontae Smith, being able to motion him around, put him in the slot. We've seen Devontae have a lot of success on like slot fades and really being able to take advantage of those matchups. I think that's a big part of Kellen Moore's offense. Having Jahan Dotson, a guy with the speed and the physicality to play on the outside, who also can play inside, I think it's going to be really important for this offense. So, I know it's like the number 3 wide receiver spot can sometimes be viewed like, who cares? This is a really talented offense. But listen, Quez Watkins was the number 3 last year. He played 50% of the Eagles snaps last season. And I obviously, going into training camp, they didn't really improve on that Quez Watkins role. A lot of fans would tell you that they needed to improve on that Quez Watkins role. Quez Watkins could obviously stretch the field, but maybe wasn't somebody you could really count on in big moments. I think Jahan Dotson is actually an upgrade at that spot, and I think that that's significant. Now, listen, we can talk about the price. I do think that it was a hefty price to pay for a number 3 receiver. I think the draft value charts kind of equal it out to a late 3rd round pick that the Eagles gave up. But again, for what he's going to bring to the offense, I do understand the move. I think it's a move that they kind of needed to make, and I think he was maybe a little bit better than what I expected them to be able to get on the trade market.
Well, we saw last year too late what happens when an AJ Brown or a Devontae Smith go down with an injury, and all of a sudden you're turning to your depth receivers. The Eagles are thinking, God forbid this happens this upcoming season, but you want to be prepared for those moments. And EJ, as you mentioned, just the 3rd receiver competition in training camp has not really dazzled many of us, I would say. There's a lot of contenders. There have been a lot of contenders for that 3rd receiver role throughout training camp. We saw Paris Campbell brought in John Ross, Britton Covey, Johnny Wilson, and Nia Smith, the 2 rookies. And they've that group has sustained quite a few injuries and that have affected their abilities to compete for that role. That said, they are not totally out of the question for the initial 53-man roster. In fact, there's, several of them will make it. But when you think of the fact that now they've got this extra player in Jahan Dotson, his arrival, who might be the odd man out of that group?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that Britton Covey's role is probably pretty solidified because of his special teams value as a returner. So, you can't forget he was one of the best punt returners in the NFL last year. And it was actually interesting hearing from him last week. He talked about the new format for the kickoff returns, and he talked about how it's a little bit more similar to a punt return situation where you kind of needed to be able to get your feet, kind of stick a foot in the ground and go. It's not really dancing around as much. So, I think he's going to bring value there. He also talked about the need to have a volume of returns there. So, anyway, I think Covey's role on the roster is pretty solidified as a return specialist. The strides that he's made as a slot receiver, I think, is a bonus. But, I think we're really talking about Paris Campbell and John Ross, and maybe Nia Smith is in there too. I think Paris Campbell is the one that I would really say is kind of in danger by the Jahan Dotson addition. I think Campbell went into training camp kind of as the front runner for that number 3 spot. Johnny Wilson had a moment there, but obviously he's been in the concussion protocol. We haven't seen as much of him. I think Campbell, because he had the production in the NFL, would have made sense as a number 3, but again, Dotson's arrival kind of spells the end of that speculation for Campbell. I think he could still be an interesting number 5 or number 6, but at some point you are going to start looking at the rookies, Nia Smith and especially Johnny Wilson, who has shown some nice things during camp. And then you're also going to look at Covey and, a guy like Joseph Ngata even, who have been with the team. Again, Covey is a guy who has a lot of special teams value. When you get to those last couple roster spots at positions like receiver, corner, tight end, linebacker, a lot of positions, you start to really have to factor in special teams contributions. I'm not sure if Campbell's really going to, that's I don't know if that's favorable for Campbell is what I would say. So yeah, I would say Campbell is the first one that comes to mind, who's most affected by Dotson's arrival. We'll see if he plays today. I think that will be very telling, but even if he doesn't play, which I would be surprised by, I feel like he has an uphill battle at this point.
No, absolutely. I think we're going to talk about all of these position groups and kind of the last few spots on the initial 53 and who's contending for them. And it's we're into the 3rd preseason game, so that's pretty much what you got to watch for. And I think that's definitely one of the position groups and one of the players in Paris Campbell that we'll be keeping an eye on today. Another player that I'm sure both of us will be watching and a lot of you will be watching at home is Cooper DeJean. He is expected to play in his first preseason game today against the Vikings, and DeJean has been sidelined for the majority of training camp with a hamstring injury. He finally came back to practice, actually in New England. The Patriots joint practice that Tuesday, did not play in the game just 2 days later, but he said at the time that he was optimistic that he would be able to play today against the Vikings, and lo and behold, he is out there warming up. We will see if he is actually, able to play and how much he plays. I think that's also going to be a big question. Where he is going to play has also been a question throughout camp. Is he going to primarily focus in the nickel? Is he going to primarily focus outside? Is he going to play safety? We've seen most of him, I think, through to this point in camp. We've seen him play mostly at nickel, but, has also had some experience playing corner. Haven't really seen him at safety. What do you expect to see from DeJean today in terms of his alignment on the field and also just the snap count too?
Yeah, I would guess that he plays primarily as a slot corner. I could see him in that Quinyon Mitchell role where he plays in the slot when they're in nickel personnel, but he bumps outside. But listen, if he plays safety, that's going to be interesting today. I think, especially when you look at like the depth chart at safety, what they have behind CJ Gardner-Johnson and Reed Blankenship, which is important because both of those guys have missed time in the last couple of seasons. It's not really, I mean, they've got Sidney Brown, who is currently injured. And then it's kind of like James Bradbury's there, Tristan McCollum is there. You start to have like a mix of safeties, and then Avonte Maddox is also kind of factored into there. And I think that Maddox might be an important guy to keep in mind. Right now, nothing's set in stone, so don't hold me to this if it changes by the time I release my 53-man roster projection. But I kind of call it 2.5 safeties that I have on the roster because I view Maddox as half safety, half nickel corner. I think that Cooper DeJean, again, is somebody who could factor into that depth, at that position, at least for the first couple of weeks. So I think it'll be interesting to see if he does play some safety. If I had to guess, based off of what he told us, I would guess that he'd play in the nickel most of the time. But even still, I think that one of the most, like, the way I would put it is like, there's not going to be very many players on the field today that could have a real role, in the defense in week one more than Cooper DeJean. I think Cooper DeJean has a real chance to contribute to this team. He's going to have to make a late run because of all the time he missed. But if you told me Cooper DeJean was like playing 50 or 60% of the Eagles' defensive snaps in Brazil, I think it'd be ambitious, but I think it's still, within the realm of possibility. I think they could put Quinyon Mitchell on the outside exclusively and let Cooper DeJean operate out of the slot. So I definitely think that it's going to be interesting to see how he plays. I think he still has something to earn in this game. It's obviously not a roster spot like a lot of the other guys, but I think it's a meaningful role from the start of the season.
All right, well, we'll see what his workload exactly is. Let's talk about some of the other positional battles that are going to play out on the field today. Kind of guys looking to snag those last couple roster spots on the initial 53. As always, it is the initial 53, and there is a 16, possibly 17-man practice squad that the Eagles also have the benefit of game day elevations to call up. So just because some of these players don't make the initial 53 doesn't mean that they won't be on the Eagles in 2024, and doesn't mean you won't see them on game day or even on the 53-man roster at some point. But anyway, so let's talk about cornerback and some of the final players that might be contending for a spot on the roster. And I think the three that stand out who have been contributors on the team in the past are Eli Ricks, Josh Jobe, and Zach McPherson. It's interesting. I published my 53-man roster projection, and I'm already starting to second guess myself on certain things. And I'm sure that today's game will influence some of my final decisions before Tuesday's 4 p.m. official cut down. But I had Eli Ricks on my initial 53 simply because I think he is the better cornerback of the three. He may not have the same special teams value of the other two. However, I think that Eli Ricks as a corner has the most upside. And he also probably, in my opinion, he's least likely to be able to clear waivers potentially, and I also think we talked about earlier too, EJ, like I think we overestimate how much other teams value like the bottom of the roster guys on the Eagles or any given team, on any other team. So perhaps it's a little bit of delusion. But for the sake of the exercise that I did, I had Ricks making it. When you look at this group, EJ, who do you think has the best chance at making that initial 53?
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that these next couple of days there are a lot of second guessing that happens with predicting the 53-man roster. I think we all put too much thought into it. I think it's like the competitive aspect of us. We all want to get it all right. So I also have Ricks on at the moment, is what I would say. I think that he does have a good chance. Kind of what you said. I think if you're just looking at like who has had the best camp as a cornerback, I think Eli Ricks is the clear winner there. I think your waiver point is a good one because it's like, listen, there are 32 teams. The likelihood of these guys getting claimed because, we notice that they look pretty good in camp is pretty low. But that said, Eli Ricks is still like an intriguing profile for a player. He's 6'2". Obviously, he was a 5-star recruit, played at two big schools at LSU and also at Alabama. And to say that he played a lot for the Eagles secondary last year maybe isn't the compliment that we think it would be because of how poorly, the Eagles secondary performed last year. But I do think that he's an intriguing player that I think other teams might view as an intriguing player, especially because he made the 53 last year. So, I think that if you're looking, I know that the waiver thing is overstated, but I also like to sometimes look, just ask myself, who would be the hardest player to get through waivers. Like, you don't want to just put, just because, Eli Ricks might clear waivers. Well, that doesn't mean that you put somebody who would definitely clear waivers on the roster. So I think if you're looking at those three guys, I think Eli Ricks is probably the hardest one to make it through. I think Zach McPherson's also an interesting one just because of the draft pedigree. And I think sometimes people forget, before Josh Jobe was like the special teams ace, Zach McPherson was the special teams ace. He had, a really good 2022 where he was one of the best special teams contributors on the team. So, I think at this point you could probably get him on the practice squad. So I feel like, he's one of the guys like who is right on the bubble for me. And I think that if I had to go with a corner, I'd go Ricks. I think we could learn something today, though, for sure. I think that today's game could influence that.
Mm-hmm. And we could really twist ourselves into pretzels about all of these, about just like going back and forth over everything. Let's continue to do that. Offensive line, looking at the depth behind the obvious starters, and then there's some locks in terms of the depth. I think Tyler Steen, even though the right guard position hasn't officially been called as far as the starter, the competition there between Steen and Becton, seemingly Becton is the front runner there. And then, players like Fred Johnson, he's likely to make the roster as the swing tackle. But when you look beyond those players, there's a few others that are competing for maybe one spot in Brett Toth, Darian Kennard, Max Sharping, Matt Hennessy. Sharping, I don't think necessarily we have seen much good of him. He struggled quite mightily in the last preseason game. Matt Hennessy has been sidelined with an injury as of late, so we just haven't seen a lot of him. But even before that, he seemingly fell down the depth chart, which kind of leaves us with Toth and Kennard. EJ, if you're looking at this group, who do you feel the best about in terms of their chances at making that initial 53?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to Toth and Kennard. I think that there's like a sliding door scenario where the Eagles do some roster chicanery and have Tyler Steen start the year on IR. He'll have to miss 4 games if they do that, as long as they have one of the 2 designated spots. We're not going to get too into all the roster machinations, but I do think there's a world where both Toth and Kennard can make it onto the 53. If you told me I had to pick one, I probably would go Kennard by a slight margin. Toth has played some important roles for the Eagles this training camp. He's been the starting left guard at points because of injury. He's been the starting right guard at points because of injury. He has multi-positional versatility, which is what, Jeff Stoutland values out of his, reserve offensive linemen. We've seen Brett Toth play center. We've seen him play guard. We've seen him play tackle before. I think that there is value in that. I just feel like you might be able to just kind of hide him for a week. He's a vested veteran, as we figured out yesterday as we were texting about all of the different scenarios for the 53-man roster. This really has taken up a big part of our mental space the last couple of days. So basically, they don't need to. Brett Toth does not need to go through waivers. So I think there might be a little bit of Brett, you're not going to make the 53. Sorry, but we'll sign you back a couple of days later as a late birthday present. He told us last week that his birthday is September 1st, which definitely adds like a little bit of a bittersweetness to roster cutdown day for him. So, I think that there's a chance that you might see Toth not make the initial 53, but he's been around the Eagles building a lot, and I think there's a good chance that he will stay in some capacity regardless of what happens. So right now I'd have Kennard. I think they just need the extra offensive tackle depth. I think Kennard has had some nice moments. When he played 100% of the snaps against the Baltimore Ravens, I will be honest, I thought that was a red flag for him. You don't see that very often, but the more we've watched him throughout training camp, the more I think that he is an interesting developmental tackle prospect. So, yeah, I would have Kennard on just slightly over Toth. I could be convinced the other way. I could be convinced that both of them will end up on the 53 with Tyler Steen missing the first 4 weeks. I think there's a lot of scenarios that could happen. This is probably one of the harder years to project. Some years those 10 guys on the offensive line are kind of just like nailed on. It's really easy to figure it out. This year, there's definitely a handful of scenarios that could play out at the bottom of that depth chart.
We'll see if today's game, who plays, who doesn't play as much, if that impacts your thinking, EJ, if that impacts my thinking. We have time to make these decisions, even though our choices don't actually matter at all. It's just fun for us. It's real life for them. Let's talk about the running backs too. And it seems that like the top 3 are solidified, surefire locks for the roster in Saquon Barkley, Kenneth Gainwell, and Will Shipley. truthfully, they might not carry another one on the initial 53. But that being said, perhaps there is a chance that someone that they would have considered among this running backs group lower on the depth chart has a really impressive game today. And maybe the Eagles feel like they can't sneak them through waivers and onto the practice squad. Perhaps they feel like they need to keep them on the as the fourth on the initial 53. The three running backs so in camp have been Lou Nichols, Tyrion Davis Price, and Kendall Milton. I'll say I think all three of them have been solid in camp. I think Davis Price has flashed the most in the actual preseason games and has made the most of his opportunities. Granted, I think he has played the most of the three running backs. But when you look at this group, who do you think might be the most likely to contend for, if not the initial 53-man roster a spot on the practice squad?
Yeah, I think that both Lou Nichols and Tyrion Davis Price are like the two. Obviously, I agree with you. I think Tyrion Davis Price has looked better in the games. I think Lou Nichols has shown a lot of really nice things throughout training camp, and then obviously he had a really nice preseason opener that led to Nick Sirianni talking about how impressive he has been. So I think that really, like, if you're an Eagles fan that's watching this preseason game, like, I think one of the biggest things you can watch for today is if one of those running backs plays their way into the proverbial, he might have just earned a roster spot, maybe not with the Eagles, but somewhere else. So this is Jimmy Kempski behind me. He's the guy who's been in all of our heads. He's the reason we think so much about the 53-man roster is because he tries to play mind games with us. But yeah, I think that Lou Nichols or Tyrion Davis Price, maybe if they have a big game today, that could lead to just a scenario that we didn't foresee, where maybe one of those guys gets picked up. I think the Eagles would love to get one, if not both of those guys on the practice squad. It's kind of their job to see if they can force their way onto a roster somewhere. So I think that is in play if they have a big game today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we've always got to, like we said, we can have a million back and forths and a million conversations. It is the beauty of this time of year when it comes to all of these final spots. Let's talk about one last position group, inside linebacker. I think it's pretty clear at this point, the top four that we think will be making the initial 53 in Nakobe Dean, Zach Bond, Devin White, Jeremiah Trotter Jr. However, there have been some, I really should say maybe one impressive player behind them. And then also there's a player that we kind of don't know enough about. Oren Burks has just started gradually working his way back after he missed the majority of camp with an injury. He's back in practice. He finally started taking reps in team drills this week. And then Ben Van Sumeren is someone who was on the practice squad, undrafted guy last year out of Michigan State, who was really impressive in the preseason last year, has continued to be impressive in preseason this year, and has had some reps higher up on the depth chart, just, the nature of the inside linebacker position. There's a lot of rotating, and we've gotten to see him working with, the twos and certainly the third team, but at times we've also gotten to see him working with the second team defense. And he's also looked pretty strong too. So is there a scenario, EJ, where you think that the Eagles could carry potentially 5 inside linebackers on the initial 53?
I do think that is in play. I think Ben Van Sumeren, because of his special teams contributions, has a good chance of making it. I think Oren Burks is I think that today, if he plays a lot, is going to be very important. They just haven't seen very much of him. He is historically a special teams ace. He was with the 49ers. I think that he has an uphill battle to make the roster. I think it's going to come down to a day like today if he can really show a lot in a little bit of time. Otherwise, I think Van Sumeren, I think he has a really good chance of making the roster. He finished last year on the active roster. He was an interesting profile coming out of college, not just because he played at both Michigan and Michigan State, which I found very interesting, both sides of the rivalry there. But also his athletic scores were very, very impressive. I thought even when he was, when you were evaluating him as an undrafted free agent, right after the draft, I think that there was a lot of intrigue about what he could become. So, we've heard that the new kickoff format puts an onus on bigger bodies, guys who can really block in tight spaces more than maybe years past, where it was more maybe cornerbacks and safeties that you would prioritize being deep at. So I think that might lead to an extra guy or two at linebacker. And I think that Ben Van Sumeren has just played well enough to justify it. Obviously, we talked about this earlier. He could even be like an emergency tight end. At the end of the last training camp practice, he ran a pretty nice route, I would say. I would say he looked pretty competent at tight end. So, I think it speaks to the athleticism that he has. I think that's probably what will make him, a real candidate to make the roster is his ability to kind of do a lot of different jobs, some of the dirty work. So I have 5 on my current 53. I feel pretty good about that. I think honestly, of all the things you can hold me to, if you don't see Ben Van Sumeren on my 53, I think you can call me out on that one. I think that's fair.
All right. Well, I will certainly be checking that out, EJ. I also wonder too with him, like, though, if they were to try to get him on the practice squad, is he another one of those guys that there's like the paranoia of maybe again teams valuing, or like in our heads of teams valuing the bottom of the roster, or like kind of the cusp players, instead of their own, I guess. That's the big question, but I understand your point of view there, so it's making me reconsider mine. Let's transition into some of our players to watch in today's game, and obviously we'll be watching all of the players that we've already discussed. But EJ, if there's one player that you are most looking forward to checking out in today's game, who might that be?
I had to go with my namesake here, EJ Jenkins, a fellow EJ in the family of EJs. He puts periods in his name. We're not going to talk about that. I'm more of a no periods kind of guy when it comes. It's just cleaner, It's just I don't take myself too seriously, as our viewers probably have figured out by now. So, I think EJ Jenkins has had a stellar camp. At one point a couple of days ago, Nick Sirianni said, "Good job, EJ," into the microphone. I thought he was talking about me, actually. I've had a pretty good camp myself, but otherwise, I realized pretty quickly he was talking about EJ Jenkins. The tight end 3 competition, that third spot, I really think I think EJ Jenkins has distinguished himself as the third best tight end on the Eagles roster this summer. The question now becomes, do the Eagles carry 3 tight ends? Obviously, in your 53-man roster projection, you pointed out that they haven't done so since, I think it's 2020, right? So it's been a while since they have carried just 2. I think it's in play. We've talked a lot about the perceived paranoia about, oh, did this guy play his way into getting claimed on waivers? I'm not sure if EJ Jenkins really fits the like stolen on waivers claim or waiver claims type of profile, although Albert Okwebunam did last year. So, he's had some good games, I would say. But for the most part, I think they could get away with having 2 tight ends. And if they do, it's not going to spell well for my guy EJ. I think he'll probably end up on the practice squad. But honestly, when I start to struggle with like who's going to make it, what I settle on is usually I put a list of the guys who are on the bubble and I just pick the guys who have had the best camp. I think EJ Jenkins has had a good enough camp to earn the spot. And I think, that's probably rationale enough. Is he's looked good. The Eagles preach competition all the time. So I think that rationale would lead to EJ Jenkins being on. So I think a good game today is going to help a lot, which is why I listed him. And mostly, I'm just going to be honest, I listed him because his name is EJ. Always got to look out for a fellow EJ.
You've got that EJ bias. I am really interested our EJ here, this EJ. I'm interested to see how much he plays. If he is given the quick hook, does that mean that he's safe and he's already locked down a roster spot? If he is allowed to play the majority of the game and he's really fighting for his job out there, I think that will also be interesting to see. So we'll see what happens with EJ Jenkins in today's game. I, on the other hand, am very intrigued to see what is going to happen behind CJ Gardner-Johnson and Reed Blankenship when it comes to the safety position and the depth that they have there. As you mentioned earlier, EJ, they've kind of got like, Avonte Maddox can play safety, but he can also play nickel. So maybe he's kind of like one half in each position. He counts there. But what about James Bradberry? We've talked about Bradberry a lot throughout the preseason, and he is someone that is in the middle of making this transition from cornerback to safety. He is getting the opportunity because Gardner-Johnson has been dealing with some injury stuff too. So he's kind of been on a snap count. And, we've seen Bradberry, we've seen Maddox playing alongside Reed Blankenship with the first team defense. Vic Fangio has had some pretty, I think in terms of as positively as Vic Fangio can kind of talk about someone publicly, he said some decent things about Bradberry in terms of just he has played better than he expected at safety. I don't know if that, I guess coming out of my mouth in that moment just now, it sounds like that could really be taken one way or the other in terms of whether that's a positive or a negative. But you know what, we'll see. I think, the Eagles, if they cut him, they're on the hook to pay his salary. So they could find a use for him, and perhaps this is a use that they could make with Bradberry. I'm also interested in seeing if Tristan McCollum is able to kind of continue to push for a spot. He is someone that played a little bit toward the end of last season. including in that Tampa Bay Buccaneers game. Mostly, again, like a special teams contributor there, but is he someone that could potentially make a push for a 53-man roster spot as well? Yeah, so we'll see. Those are kind of like the big questions there at safety. It's they're thin there. Sidney Brown is still on PUP. There's a chance that he could start there, when the season begins, and that the Eagles wouldn't have to take him off of PUP and put him on the initial 53 and use a roster spot on him. So it'll be very interesting to see that I think that spot at safety. There's just a lot of question marks right now. So I'm eager to see how that all plays out. EJ, I think we are out of time for today. Great chatting with you as always. Again, if you're over on inquirer.com/Eagles game day in today's game, we will continue the conversation over there. I'm happy to answer any questions throughout the game as things get underway. So yeah, looking forward to commenting and chatting with you guys in real time.
Yeah, and before we sign off, make sure to catch up on the latest episodes of the Uncovering the Birds podcast with Jeff McClain. You can find it on your favorite podcast platform or directly at inquirer.com/podcasts.
That is all for today, everyone. Thanks again for tuning into Gameday Central. We will see you next time.